Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Don's sitting in the host chair today. Going to take the what if going back in time machine out with a guest here today. Happy to be joined today by Dylan Holzemer. Dylan's one of our listeners, and he is proof. Sometimes you have to wait a little while for it to happen, but if you suggest a topic, we most often reach out to the suggester of that topic and ask if they want to be part of the episode. And that's how we've met a lot of people that are now a regular part of the A Fork in Time team. And I'm really happy to have Dylan join us today for today's episode. And I was telling him off podcast before I let him introduce himself. Now, let him actually introduce the topic after he introduces himself. It's his topic. I think he deserves the right to do that. Is Dylan, you may have stumbled into, and we'll talk about it afterwards, the easiest A Fork in Time ever. And the reason I will say that, I think it'll be clear to our listeners, is you could just say, look around, you're living in that forked world. But you and I both agree that that's probably not the case, probably never was the case, although it may be an interesting thing to speculate as we talk about part of the period of time that I'm sure we'll go through here when this was more widely held. But Dylan, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to let you talk, introduce yourself, and then introduce the topic, if you would.
Hey, Don, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm Dylan Holzemer. I'm a born and raised Memphian. I used to do tours for 6 or 7 years down on Beale Street, including talking a lot of Elvis stuff. I have had more than enough arguments for one lifetime about whether or not Elvis actually is still alive. So the idea that he could still be out there is really kind of interesting, but you're right. It is basically one of the easiest things in the world, because basically we can just tell people to watch Bubba Hotep and then we can finish the episode.
So, but by Dylan's introduction there, you can see that our topic today is going to be, what if Elvis had lived? Now, the period of time we're talking about here, Elvis's death, is August 16th of 1977 at the age of 42. Because one of the interesting things is I was doing the little bit of prep that I did for the episode, felt like I could do this one because I grew up, as an Elvis fan, being aware of who he was, even though I was a kid when he passed away. Before I got sucked down, as I was telling Dylan, the YouTube rabbit hole last night, which is an easy place to go sometimes when you're doing research on popular culture. I knew he was young. I'm 54, so I think of 42 now as being incredibly young, younger than I used to think of it as being. But only 42. He lived a lot in those 42 years. We can talk a little bit about before we break off to the diversion here. But most of you will remember the story around he was found dead. Pronounced dead actually at the hospital, but probably was already dead there at Graceland. Was found dead, and the official cause of death was a heart attack or heart failure. A lot of speculation because the toxicology report, there was an autopsy, but since it was ruled natural causes, wasn't really formally released. Obviously, it got leaked out, into the press and other places. So there are people that are aware that there were just almost a pharmacy worth of drugs found in his system of varying types. Prescription drugs, by the way. He had Dr. Nick to make sure he was taken care of all the time when he needed what he needed. But, a lot of things that were to regulate sleep cycles, the other things that went on because of his celebrity, you might argue. But what we're going to argue here as our fork in time is, imagine that event does happen. So on August 16th, Elvis does have a medical incident. But instead of being found dead there at Graceland, he's found still conscious, not conscious, but at least still alive. He's rushed to the hospital there in Memphis, and the doctors are able to intervene and revive him, get him stable again. And as a result, we don't have the tragic death of the King of Rock and Roll at the age of 42 in 1977, but we have him living beyond that. And what Dylan and I decided off podcast was that we think that would have been a moment of reckoning for the king, and that as a result, he probably would have had some lifestyle changes. That means that this was not just a temporary couple of months, maybe a couple of years delay in him passing, but would have had the chance for him, still being relatively young, to go on to live, fairly normal life, as normal as you can be when you're the king of rock and roll, I guess, but in terms of a length of life. And one of the things we also talked about, which will also be our premise here, is not only that he survives, but obviously has that lifestyle change. And again, he's still young enough to have a career after this. And so we can talk a little bit about what that career would be. Do a fair job of summarizing that for us, Dylan?
Yeah, pretty much. The interesting thing is going to be sort of, because when Elvis passed away, he was at this kind of weird point in his life because, he's been in Vegas for so long. He's been kind of trapping himself, and sort of burdening himself with all of this stuff that's going on. So the idea of this kind of moment where we cut him off, Elvis passes away, and seeing sort of what continues to happen after that is really kind of interesting. So I think the first question is sort of what does he do? I think probably initially he just chills out, stays in the hospital, recovers, and then just kind of isolates himself in Graceland just to kind of cut everybody off. Because, those of you who have seen the recent movie, they do a good job of showing this kind of, Elvis sort of feeling obligated to support all of these people. And especially with Colonel Tom and, some of the other folks that were around him, keeping him sort of, I hate to use the phrase strung out because of the drug connotations, but basically strung out, having to support all these people that were basically, making their livelihood and their lives off of him. So I think the hospital sort of extended stay and recuperation provides him a clean break to kind of wrap his head around everything that's been going on pretty much since the 68 comeback special and he goes to Vegas. And this provides a kind of introspective period for him. I think that's really kind of the initial sort of step of what happens with him is he goes in isolation, and then it's kind of, okay, what happens from there? What does he decide to do? Where does he decide to take his own career? Because he's got this freedom that he hasn't had in, 7 years, basically.
Right. Yeah. And one of the interesting things to me, as I was going back, and I have not seen the movie yet, want to see the movie. It's streaming now, so maybe I'll get a chance to actually pick it up that way as being an easier way to do it, is I think of different phases of Elvis's life career. And you mentioned the 68, what became known as the comeback special. I discovered an interesting thing to me last night as I was watching some of this, which I didn't know. Originally, that was intended to be just like an Elvis Christmas special. Yeah. And what was interesting about it was that Elvis sort of took control of it in a way that wasn't intended, and he turned it into something which is, considered to be one of the landmark moments in his career, a career full of a lot of landmarks in a lot of ways. And it's called the comeback special because he'd almost become, at least to some degree, especially in the years right before that, a cliche, riding a lot on the stardom of the early 50s, but what had he really done after a series of really bad movies that had some really interesting music, but they made, as you said, made money, and they made money regularly to keep this lifestyle and the entourage and, what had been built around the Elvis machine, so to speak. In fact, I was really thinking about when you were talking there earlier about, the three letters that he's sort of known by. His motto was what? Taking care of
TCB
business, right? It was not so much Elvis the singer, who, by the way, I think is underrated in a lot of ways. I think he's thought of as being more of an entertainer than the actual capabilities that he had as just a vocalist, which is, part of what obviously allowed him to succeed. But it wasn't Elvis the pelvis. It wasn't the dance. And yes, that was part of the image, a little bit of the, early 50s bad boy. He was the okay bad boy, kind of thing to a degree, but he was a talented musician, a talented, musical artist, a talented singer, but a lot of that had gotten lost just in the Elvis part, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about Elvis is because when I was kind of doing some prep work, this idea kind of resurfaced that he is somehow both, when you think of Elvis, you don't think of the man, you think of the big TCB logo with the lightning bolt. So he somehow becomes a caricature of himself that's both greater than and less than who he really was. He's one of the most dynamic characters that you can really, if you actually look into it, of the 1950s. And I will, spoiler alert for anybody who's thinking about coming to Memphis, most of us do not like Elvis. We're used to seeing his billboard to go to Graceland. It's the thing we do when relatives come in town. My uncle has a terrible story about finding the tackiest thing in the Graceland gift shop. So if you do come to Memphis, it's worth going, but don't expect a lot of Memphians to be able to give you a lot of insight because he's just the guy that we see on the signs on the side of the road. It's like your car crash lawyer billboards. But I think, understanding sort of who he was as a person, and then sort of also this sort of mythic kind of like all the people that are known by first names, Elvis, Prince, all of that, this mythos, understanding how those come in is really kind of interesting.
I agree.
Because
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Don.
No, please go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, he, like you were talking about, he has these kind of career rises and falls. He starts off as this young kid from Tupelo who comes up to Memphis and basically just he literally pesters Sam Phillips' secretary at Sun Studios into letting him record. That's how he gets discovered, because Sam Phillips is like, oh crap, this kid won't leave me alone. I've got to just shut him in the recording studio so that he'll shut up and leave me alone. That's basically how he gets discovered. And then, he has this stratospheric, music career. Then he does the movies and gets kind of wrapped into the sort of what's the car chase, vehicle chase of the week movie. Right. And then he comes back and does the 68 special. And then he kind of regresses into another caricature of himself where he's got the peacock feathers and the Vegas Review and all of that. So he has this really kind of interesting, he somehow finds a way to make fun of himself and iconograph himself to the point where nobody really knows what's underneath. And that's what's really going to be kind of interesting, is figuring out sort of where does this guy go outside of that? And I think
I think you hit on the head there, because it's, as I was thinking this through last night, I'm trying to think, just, okay, this is 77. So let's say that by 78, 79, things are stabilized well enough that, okay, now it's time to return back to whatever it means to be a music, even how he may have thought of himself. Is he an entertainer? Yeah. Is he a musician? Is he, how does he even, self-identify at that point before, thinking about how he presents himself to his public? By the way, a public that still, well, obviously by the fact that they won't let him in the real world, they would not let him die. Elvis left the building. He left the building. He's still somewhere. He just left the building. Right. Yeah. Kind of concept is, he had an adoring public. I think a public that would have been incredibly forgiving of whatever they learned as a result of this incident if he lives, because they were incredibly forgiving of what they learned, even when this incident cost his life. It's tragic. It becomes more tragic, perhaps, than you'd like it to be, but a very forgiving, wide fan base that would have allowed him to come back and do pretty much probably whatever he wanted to do, and they would have been clamoring for it, particularly after that event. So in my head, where I'm going here is, is he a country artist? This is the middle of disco, for goodness sakes. I
don't think Elvis would be doing disco. I think we can safely say that. But otherwise, it is interesting. And I kind of divide this into two options. My initial thought was, there's this weird thing in Memphis musicians, particularly, where something terrible happens, they get in the hospital, and then they decide to start a church. That's basically what Al Green did. It's right down the street from Graceland. So my initial thought was, well, he was in spiritual stuff at the time. Does he go and start off his own church and do the Al Green thing? Because he was always very into gospel and it was a deep part of his life. But at that point, he had kind of gotten away from organized religion. So I don't think that's really the option. So I think the choice really is, and this is kind of how I lay it out, Margaritaville or no Margaritaville is really the question, I think, that comes up. Because Jimmy Buffett, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this to the audience who's trying to figure out what the heck is this guy doing on this podcast. Jimmy Buffett wrote and recorded Margaritaville in February of 1977. Elvis dies in August, but Jimmy Buffett, in numerous interviews over the years, has always said that song was intended for Elvis. So I think if he sits a couple years out of the spotlight, he sees this song. I think that's probably the most tailor-made song for him to record as kind of his big comeback. And then sort of, does he kind of do, a sort of almost a Aloha from Hawaii review with all these kind of beach songs and sort of kind of hang out, the beach volleyball scene from Top Gun is the most iconic theme from the 80s. Does he go with the beach theme for a few years and kind of bring himself back? I think that's one of the more realistic options in terms of what gets him back in the spotlight and inspires him to come back, because he hadn't had a hit since, I think, what was it? I think Burnin' Love in 74 was his last number one hit. So he hadn't had a hit. If he comes back in 79, 80, he hasn't had a hit in 8 years, 6, 7, 8 years. So he's got to find something. And I think Margaritaville is kind of the perfect vehicle for that, really, to get him back.
Oh, wow. And like what often happens here on A Fork in Time is, the ripples proceed from there. So that becomes Elvis is known for that song. Jimmy Buffett, I'm sure, lands just fine.
Yeah,
He's gonna be okay.
He's got other stuff. I think he's good.
Yeah, but probably that's probably his most widely known song. So that changes the career path for a lot of casual Jimmy Buffett fans or those who are just familiar with him. That changes his career path. And this is what happens when you change one little moment in history and you let somebody not have a heart attack or die of a drug overdose, whatever it is. Suddenly you're affecting. There's no such thing as parrot heads, or at least they're not maybe called the same thing when they're moving forward. How that can ripple through. The other thing that again, trying to define what his where he would land in the music scene of the late 70s and transitioning into the 80s. I'm a teenager of the 80s, so the 80s is my other area of music. Growing up with older parents, listening to a lot of older country. I grew up on Conway Twitty and Merle Haggard and a lot of 60s and early 70s country. That was before I was allowed to adjust the knob on the radio. That's what I heard, kind of thing. If there was music purchased in our house, it was going to be that. But then the other musical influence on me, it was later that I came back in to understand there's all kinds of other music in the 70s, for goodness sake. Discovered that more as an adult, was being pop music of the 80s. So I was trying to lay, in the 5 to 10 years after 77, what was the musical scene? Well, the musical scene post-disco was a little all over the place. Music in the 80s is a little, chaotic in terms of what's happening on the pop side. Country is starting to sound a little more pop. There's more of that, blending of those two styles together. And so, part of it was figuring out where Elvis was going to land musically, but then also it really kicked into me because she's a little bit younger than I am, but not that much younger than I am, is he's still got a young daughter. Yeah. He's, he and Priscilla divorced, I guess, in 73. We don't know I guess I'll just ask you, Dylan, it's your scenario here. Does he end up marrying, I guess Ginger Alden was the girlfriend of the day, the fiance, she had been given a ring. Do you think he ends up with her? Does he end up after this event, going in a different direction there? Because that's going to influence the next thing I was going to suggest we talk about a little bit.
Yeah, so Elvis and his post Priscilla relationships are it's kind of a hard topic to talk about because you have to look at all these things pre his death, because once his death comes into play, I don't believe Elvis he either never changed his will or he never had a will in the first place. So Lisa Marie and Priscilla ended up controlling a lot of the estate. And so that was actually one of the things I was going to bring up. Is it's interesting to see sort of the Elvis story told over the years from their perspective. Right. My theory actually was going to be that he at some point not necessarily gets remarried, but sort of reconciles with Priscilla, actually. And they kind of, even if they're not married, he doesn't keep seeing a bunch of different girls, and maybe even Priscilla moves back into Graceland just for the stability of Lisa Marie's sake. Because only child Lisa Marie is immediately going to be, even without famous parents, the most spoiled child on the face of the planet. Right. Not necessarily in a bad way, but she is going to be the most spoiled. I think he probably maybe breaks it off with Ginger, not at the altar, but sometime in the engagement, and then he may go around with, some of the early heartthrobs of the 80s, which is before my time. So I'm not going to try and name any, but I think eventually, maybe in the mid-late 80s, the short version is he ends up in some fashion back with Priscilla, is kind of what ends up taking place in my head. Just, if not necessarily because of a sort of romantic reunion, for the benefit of his daughter. Yeah. Who then goes on in the 90s to marry Michael Jackson, and that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah. Or in this case, doesn't go to marry Michael Jackson. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you raised an important point there. My understanding, not understanding all of the legal components of that his will hadn't been changed, or he didn't have, essentially he didn't have an updated estate plan as he probably should have, which is why Priscilla, for the benefit of Lisa Marie, is the one who gains control of essentially what we know as being Elvis's estate. And by the way, to your point, guards so much of that jealously in terms of realizing she has to turn it into, I've been to Graceland. You've been by it more times probably than you can count, and other things that are there. I remember as a strange place going there to visit, is that there's elements of it that are very respected. His aunt, I guess, was still living upstairs when we toured the house in the early 90s. And, it's gated, it's an estate, so they control who can get in. You can't just drive directly up to the house. You can drive up to the gates, obviously, because it's right there on the street. But, and there was the area off to the side where the planes were parked, and the museum that's either next to it or across the street, whatever it is. So much of that was, Priscilla authorized. It was the thing that funded, continued to move things through the song catalog, the way she managed that, how artists were allowed to use it, or what was sold, or the other times were there, sustained the business part of the Elvis estate for the benefit of Lisa Marie. But then, as you will point out, she very closely guarded so much about his image and how he was portrayed. Even down to this day, there's an element of control to that because of how things work. And I agree with you. The most likely scenario is that he's back, if not with her, maybe remarried to her. Certainly they're in an amicable situation because of the shared daughter. And, again, I think the thing that pops into my head about this alternate timeline in 77, this is a sobering event. You have a sobered up Elvis as a result of this. And when Elvis was not, and again, I think, as you said, strung out is a hard choice of words, because it implies, something different in terms of the drug use, but an Elvis that is more clean-headed is capable of doing some pretty incredible things. You see that historically when you look back at his career, and he was very adaptable in terms of his music too. So I think he would have found a way to adapt into the 80s, 90s, and moving forward, whether it's Margaritaville. I like that, by the way. That probably ends up somehow as a in the title of this episode. We always struggle for out a titled episode, but it's got to be that. But I do think they end up in an amicable situation. Maybe he, like you say, I could easily imagine them reconciling and getting back together, so to speak, maybe even married. The other possibility, of course, I guess that would always be out there, is you can hardly go anywhere and talk about Elvis's. And Elvis dated a lot of women in the 70s, a lot of stars. In fact, it was almost, star of the week kind of thing that was going on there. But the one you will always hear about is Anne Margaret. Of course, she was married at this point, but, later she writes in one of her books, essentially she thought they were soulmates. They were sort of, if it had not been for the fact that he was already engaged to Lisa Marie, that would have been strange. A place we don't even want to go. But to Priscilla, they might have ended up together because of the reasons that they found affinity with each other. Any thoughts in your mind that possibility exists that after this event he sobers up and says, well, yeah, Priscilla is the mother of my daughter, but the love of my life, and I'm not going to mess this up, is the one that I let get away, and that's Anne Margaret. Any concept there, Dylan, about how that could have turned out?
It's hard to say, because he also dated a lot of women even before Priscilla and even during Priscilla. Natalie Wood is the famous one from the late 50s and early 60s during his movie star phase. So, right. I mean, he has these really famous star-studded, relationships, both before and after. I think a lot of that is it's kind of hard to discern what was done for the publicity's sake, whether it was officially publicized or not, and what was really going on with Elvis. So honestly, truth be told, I don't even know how, that would sort of come into his calculus, really, truth be told.
Okay. So we'll assume in our alternate timeline moving forward, again, survives the 77 medical incident, has some form of whatever you want to call sobering up. We'll leave that to sort of our listeners to decide what that is. And I'm going to go ahead and put him back with Priscilla. That just gives us a good stable place to move forward as we go over time. So now we've established firmly what the fork is. You mentioned the Margaritaville possibility. I'm guessing there's no Lisa Marie, Michael Jackson circus at some point under this scenario, that there's no way that that's going to happen.
That would be my guess, but I don't discount, her marrying somebody famous, whether it's a musician or a director of some sort. Because the other thing that I was going to say is, there's also a film element that we may have to look into once Elvis is free of the Colonel. So there's no telling if, the Presley family becomes, as the generations go on, more of a film family, like it actually kind of has, because one of his granddaughters is actually a fairly successful actress now. I think it's a much less tabloid relationship with his kids, and even some of Priscilla's subsequent relationships. So I think it becomes less of a sort of tabloid mania, kind of National Enquirer style family as you might think of them in kind of the 80s and 90s, and more of a still newsworthy, but more respectably newsworthy kind of event of, Elvis Presley's daughter marries some critically acclaimed movie star musician. Not that Michael Jackson wasn't critically acclaimed, but, it becomes sort of the same thing with different players in a much more respectable play, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, one of my good friends made the comment once about the Lisa Marie, Michael Jackson. It was like Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey getting together. It was sort of a marriage of two circuses, kind of deal. And I think that's probably a fair way to describe it in a lot of ways. I remember, watching that from outside, and even talking to family members, particularly older family members, who were sort of, shocked by this. Not shocked at all because of the racial implications, but just shocked about, if Elvis were alive today, he would.
Oh yeah, exactly.
He would be, he'd be protective of her image, and obviously his own, and all the other stuff that went there. That they were just, if he's not dead, he's rolling over. If he is dead, he's rolling over in his grave, kind of thing. Was the concept there.
Yeah, which is ironic because you start thinking of, because one of the other things that Elvis did, especially with his music, is he didn't write his own songs, which is why, the Margaritaville thing is interesting, because Jimmy Buffett wrote the song for him. But, his whole career is really, he's more of a reimaginer than a sort of directly creative person, because even his first couple of hits were adaptations of, old R&B music. That's All Right Mama is an old blues tune out of Chicago. Blue Moon of Kentucky is a bluegrass tune out of, obviously, Kentucky. So you think of people in the 80s that he was going to, collaborate with. Michael Jackson is the biggest name on that list. So it's interesting to think of, had Elvis been alive, they probably would not have really gotten along very well, both musically and, the later sort of carnival show that ends up being their marriage that now doesn't happen. It's such an interesting, just that alone. You could really do a fork just on that, is what if Lisa Marie never married Michael Jackson?
Right.
Goes on after that.
Yeah. And you mentioned there just about his, adapting, other people writing for him, adapting music. I was sharing off podcast. So I'll share this story with the listeners now. Dylan is he dies in 1977. One of the things we had in the house that I grew up in was we had a stereo system that actually allowed you to make 8-track tapes. I'll put some links in the show notes for our listeners who need to know what an 8-track tape is, because that now goes back far enough that you may even need that. But I was sharing with Dylan that it had the inputs where you could record from another 8-track, you could record from like a turntable type of thing, or you could record off the radio that was built into the stereo unit. And so we ended up with a lot of these homemade 8-tracks in the late 70s, I guess, even into the early 80s. Mom was doing those. And one of the ones I remember actually was an Elvis one, and it had been recorded off of a radio special. And so Mom had recorded to the 8-track there, which we could play, and a couple of the vehicles had 8-tracks in them. And the problem was, it was a compilation of things, but also included from what was later concerts. I think one of his better known to a lot of people pieces of later music, which is American Trilogy. And in the 8-track tape ran out in the middle of American Trilogy. And so it like gets to a certain point, and there's like the secondary tape, which is the rest of the special. And my listening to it, even up until I was in high school, I guess, listening back to this thing, was you got to about halfway through American Trilogy, then you had to swap the 8-tracks to hear the rest of it. And it was worth hearing the rest of, because it's this very, very powerful combination of, again, hence the name American Trilogy, well-known songs that are about America, but they've been done in Elvis's style. He's made them Elvis in what he's done there. And, that was, I think, one of his gifts as a musician and as a performer, was being able to adapt things and make them his own, that weren't his own originally, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that I think is one of the most exciting things about what would have happened if he keeps going, because even by the end of his sort of Vegas run, he's getting very kind of derivative. He's doing a lot of, they're almost straight covers instead of sort of reimaginings of the song. He does one of the ones that you'll hear a lot if you listen to a lot of live cuts of Elvis is you'll hear him do Three Dog Nights, Never Been to Spain. And if you listen to those two back to back, it's more of a straight just cover. He doesn't do a whole lot of changing to the orchestration, the instruments, the singing. Whereas some of the other stuff, even That's All Right, he completely redoes the song in Vegas compared to how he did it in 1954 when he was at Sun Studios. So, the sort of reinvention of the 80s is really kind of interesting. And, one of the things that I kept thinking about is, he did the same thing with the movies. He started off with this, he always wanted to be a movie star. He would see people, doing the Westerns and things. And, he wanted to go out and be that kind of respectable in music too. He wanted to be this sort of respectable, famous person, not kind of like a sideshow sort of, oh, he's that wild kid that shakes his pelvis all over the stage. And the movies kind of got to be like that too. He was a big fan of like King Creole, other than the fact that they turned it into a musician movie, a singing Elvis movie instead of what it originally should have been. He was, a lot of his movies, the early ones, he really became a fan of. And it was only later, once he got sucked into these contracts where I was joking before we started, it was kind of the vehicle chase of the week movie. He's got the boat, he's got the car, he's got the motorcycle, he's got the plane. It's like, oh God, what are they going to come up with next? I think one of the other things that a break in the late 70s gives him is maybe it gives him some distance to try and return to that Hollywood sort of movie star kind of role that he had, because now he's free of the Colonel's influence, so I can kind of see him as part of his cleanup, doing the same thing that he did with the 68 comeback special, where he gets into this just absolutely fantastic shape. He would set in the 68 comeback special. He was more fit than he was at any time since he came out of the Army. So imagining him, I was looking before trying to find some movies that he might have fit in the 80s, as this kind of, sort of older, respectable, kind of character actor almost. Cause I think that's really a part of his career that doesn't get thought about as much. The possibilities that could have happened, even in the late 60s, what if he had kept doing movies as a respectable actor is really kind of an interesting thing.
Not just as theatrical, musical.
Yeah, not as the singing cowboy, so to speak.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because the thing that popped into my head there, which is weird, but I think applies to this, would he have had at some point in 1980s his Cher acting moment? Where, one of the things about, Cher as a performer, now for decades and decades, sort of reinventing herself, constantly over time. But what I remember, Moonstruck, and I guess I'm trying to think what else would have been in the 80s. Mask, I guess, would have been in the 80s with Cher. Again, they were not musical vehicles. That was her as an actress, and she had obviously capabilities there. Academy Award nominations and everything that went with that. So you're suggesting there's this path where we don't just think of Elvis, a later Elvis, as a musician or as a musical act, but we think of him really as as an actual
pop
actor.
Culture. Yeah, he's kind of a pop culture renaissance man, really, if you think about it. And I don't know what he would star, but that's kind of the trick, is because the 80s are this weird period in cinema too, where you've got your Top Guns and things like that. Obviously, I don't think he's going to star in that, but some of the other, some of the more serious movies, because that's really what he was going for. I'm trying to scroll through a list of 80s movies to see if anything jumps out at me that he might fit in. Maybe like a Full Metal Jacket as kind of a, just sort of an odd kind of off guy, random thing. But I think that's an interesting idea that doesn't get thought of a whole lot when you think of Elvis and, continuing, just because it's so much focus on the music, because that's what made him famous. But the movie idea, I think, is kind of unexplored and interesting.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned that, because I hadn't really even thought about that at all, Dylan, because again, I probably have seen half a dozen Elvis movies in my life. By the way, there's a lot more than that. When the number was in that, they were making those the rate of like once every 3 to 4 months. Something had to have been premiering there for a period of time. I mean, he was literally on the we got to make money. As you said, the Colonel Parker, approach to this. So it's time for another movie. It's time for another movie. I mean, it didn't matter what it was or the quality of the script. It was just he was on the movie treadmill there for a number of years, and what that produced in terms of revenue. But I hadn't really thought of him, after 77, and again, not being musical, being something else. But the 80s were full of folks that had a music connection that were also exploring acting. I'm thinking of
Purple Rain, I think, is the big musician turned movie star kind of moment.
Would be a good example of that. So that's like 84-ish, 83, 84-ish.
Yeah.
Prince. Thinking about Glenn Fry of the Eagles, who's out there, on like Miami Vice and other things like that. This was a thing. So even if it wasn't a movie vehicle, certainly could have seen him show up on some TV dramas in the 1980 in a guest starring kind of appearance. Maybe that transitions in somebody going, oh, if we gave him a real script, Elvis could do something with this, kind of thing. Yeah, I can imagine that scenario too.
Yeah. And one of the things I was thinking is, there's this interesting kind of resurgence of sort of the neo-noir kind of late 80s, hard-boiled cop movie. I think that would have been kind of an interesting thing for Elvis because, he would have grown up on the tail end. He would have been 12, 13, 14 when kind of those, just post World War II, the original noir movies would have come out. So he would have been essentially reenacting some of the movies of his childhood, but, an opportunity for really kind of critical, sort of progression and development as an actor. So I think some of those movies are really kind of interesting to imagine, Elvis, not necessarily as one of the main people in the movie, but, as kind of the police chief or as a sort of side character that kind of gets him back in the spotlight.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And you mentioned police there. If you know anything about Elvis's, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, he is aside from being a musical artist, he is a collector of police badges. Is what he turns into in the early 70s. There's a famous, picture most people have probably seen of Nixon and he in the White House, where he gets the appointment. It's like a special agent at large or something like that for drug enforcement. But he had this thing about law enforcement. So I could easily see him, if somebody tempted him with the rights, probably wouldn't even need to be the right script in the 80s with any script.
Just any cop movie in the 80s.
Yeah, you probably could have gotten him to do that just because he had an affinity for that and thought of himself in that genre. And then what goes from there? Again, it's so easy to forget how young he was. You get to the end of you get to 1990, and if Elvis is alive, he's in his mid 50s.
Yeah. And I mean, even his dad lasted until his mid 60s. So even at the least, assuming he doesn't, sort of regress after a couple of years, it's easily imaginable, especially with this, as fit as he frequently was and his metabolism and some of the habits that he did not pick up, from his mother, for instance, who's a very heavy drinker, which is one of the things that got her in 58. I don't know that we can expect him to live till now, but I think it's at least easily plausible to imagine him in not just the 90s, but even kind of the early 2000s, sort of in the twilight of his career. Yeah. What that does for 90s music, we had enough trouble with the 80s. I don't want to imagine him with like the Beastie Boys.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing that does happen, I gave the Cher reference. I think it's fair in this sense of you have a number of I hate to use the word acts because that just sounds so impersonal, but you have a number of entertainers who do reinvent themselves. They have a first act, they have a second act, they have a third act, they have a fourth act. You could easily argue that even before 77, Elvis had sort of 2 or 3 acts in his career that far. So given his age, given the fact that he was Elvis and would have had the choice to do things that, other other performers don't have the choice to do because they're not Elvis in terms of either funding it themselves. The other thing is, if somebody hadn't, somebody wasn't willing to produce the movie, he could have produced the movie if that's what he wanted to do, kind of thing. Is that you could easily imagine him having 5, 6, 7, if you will, different acts throughout the remainder of this career. And, let's just say, putting it, in perspective now, let's say he passes away sometime around, 2010, 2015. So it's only been in the last decade that we've lost Elvis. When you would see the retrospectives back there, half of his career, a little more than half of his career, would have been what happened after the 77 event. It would have been a key focal point because it would have been talking about you before and after. That would have been something that would have been covered in, every special or every documentary or whatever. But, the idea that we would be talking about Elvis a lot less about the Elvis that we know, which is early 50s. I think I'd mentioned this off podcast, Dylan. One of the conversations I have, we talk about skinny Elvis or fat Elvis. Which Elvis are you talking about here?
Yeah.
Is we would have had, you talk about actor Elvis, you talking about musician Elvis, you talking about producer. Maybe he turns into just a producer. A guy that And
I can very much see that because he had a lot of control over his sessions to do that. It's really kind of interesting.
Yeah, and so the second, third, fourth, 10th acts of Elvis, could have produced all kinds of interesting things that would have just built upon, but also have been theoretically very different than the Elvis that we do know. Just quickly, Dylan, particularly you mentioned, of course, being a native there of Memphis. We are 77. How many years are we removed? Doing the math quickly in my head, we're getting close to 50 years removed from his death. We've now at least doubled his life. He would be in his 80s now. Were he alive? Do you think he still holds a place in popular culture now that he did? Let's just pick an arbitrary year. We were talking about the 80s. Let's say where he stood in popular culture in 1990, just to pick a point. Do you think he still carries as much of a shadow over our culture today? You mentioned the number of folks who actually can be known by one name. Elvis still fits in that category.
Yeah.
Do you think he still holds a place in culture the same way that he did maybe 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I definitely think it's very different from how it is in the real timeline, because he kind of is this frozen moment at sort of the megastardom. I think you can certainly say he doesn't have the same impact in Memphis, because Graceland is the number 2 visited house in the country behind the White House. I think if he continues, even if he dies in the early 90s, I don't think Graceland becomes what it is. I don't think Memphis is the place that, I'll travel, all over the country, or I'll be out in other continents and I'll say I'm from Memphis, and people go, oh, Elvis. That's immediately what you think of. I think for Memphis, it's a much better thing because we don't become as dependent just on the tourism of Elvis for so much of our economy, which is a whole nother conversation we don't have to get into. I think he kind of becomes this sort of elder statesman of music. And actually, one of the interesting ideas that I was thinking of, kind of with the Elvis and Nixon photo, is we haven't really talked about what he would do in politics, which I don't think is a whole lot. But one of the things I think he would be remembered for in the 1990s is sort of this like anti-drug kind of, I don't want to say a meme because I think it would be more respectful than that, but one of the things that I think he would really be known for is the face of Nancy Reagan's, Say No to Drugs campaign in the 80s, which is a weird thing to pick him for. But I think that would be kind of his moment of the 80s, because he's very against, counterculture and drug use and things like that. And so I think he becomes this sort of quasi elder statesman of music and or movies, but also this sort of kind of like fringe political, almost like a stage pony, to use, not the best analogy, but I think it's this really kind of quasi, I think he's less famous in terms of, sort of the iconography of Elvis, but I think he's more famous as an actual person that we get to see more of a character arc, and a career develop from.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to pull it, Dylan. The way you described it, and the way I was thinking about it in my head as you were describing that is, we think more of Elvis versus the person that he was and the person that he becomes more than Elvis the icon.
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of folks, he's probably still is one of the most recognizable figures. You probably can go to probably places in the world I can't even imagine that you would go, and you could show people a picture of Elvis and they would know who that is. Maybe not a lot about him, but they would know who that is.
They know Elvis.
Yeah. And what that means, in the heart of Africa, what that means in the heart of Asia, it's going to mean different things in different places, no doubt. But again, probably one of the 10 to 20 most recognizable images that could exist probably in the world in terms of a person. He probably fits that category even today, which is, given how far removed we are and how much has happened since then, that's saying a lot. But I think you're right. The way he'd be remembered today is not so much that snapshot, the tragic snapshot figure icon in time view of thinking about Elvis. Ironically, what leads to this, what could have been thoughts that go with that versus actually, what would have happened. I think you're right. Him being, a spokesperson for, or like you said, a stage pony, again, not meaning that in the negative context, but somebody who would have brought attention to it for, the war on drugs in the 80s, because he was talking to Nixon about that in 70, 71 or 72, whenever it was that was there. Then the other thing that comes to mind is I can remember certainly into the 90s, into the 2000s, where you had, the comeback tours and the special things.
Mm-hmm.
The Eagles go on tour and they keep going on tour that last time over and over again. It still works for them over and over again. But imagine at some point the tour that Elvis could have had in terms of, a farewell tour or, something like that would have sold out.
Exactly.
Stadiums.
Yeah, actually, he had there's a famous, because I actually had that thought of what would he do sort of like as his career retrospective. And it's, me on my tour guide shtick again. There's a famous, not super famous, but there's a famous Sun Studios album called The $1 Million Quartet, where it's Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins, who did, obviously Jerry Lee Lewis's Great Balls of Fire. We all know Johnny Cash. Carl Perkins was the guy who wrote Blue Suede Shoes. That was actually his hit. So it's kind of interesting to imagine, in the 90s, Jerry Lee Lewis is still alive. Whether he would have ever talked to Elvis again is probably not the most likely thing without a gun in his hand. But, Johnny Cash is still around. Carl Perkins dies in a car crash, but I'm pretty sure Roy Orbison is still around in the 90s. So I think that kind of retrospective tour, like a Sun Studios revival tour headlined by all four of these guys, would have been really kind of an interesting thing to see in the 90s, because you start getting some of these remixes of Elvis anyway. Like the JXL remix of A Little Less Conversation is the big one from when I was a kid, around, not to date me, but around 2000, was kind of right in grade school. That was the thing that was on the radio. So I think that's kind of the interesting, like, rock and roll review mega tour for Elvis to really kind of cap off his career. And then he can just kind of go do whatever he wants. I think that's kind of an interesting concept, especially, to think of, like, Johnny Cash kept playing music even until his death in I forget if it was right before or right after 2010. So, the idea of him reuniting with a lot of those guys that started his career is really kind of an interesting idea once they've all kind of done their own thing. And then sort of the lines of fate sort of bring them all back together, just like they're at in Memphis at Sun Studios in 1954, to sort of bring it all back home.
Yeah. And who knows, in really bringing it forward in odd ways. Maybe he does a season or two as a host as a judge on American Idol. Who knows? There's all kinds of places you can go because of how things have morphed over time. I mean, one of the most interesting things to me, I guess I was talking to a family member about this a couple of years ago, more than once, like, again, mentioning American Idol, there are some of the various musical competition shows, they'll have a theme week. Elvis has enough of a catalog. You could have a theme week for him. And then you'll see
he actually does have a theme week. It's going on right now. Elvis week is actually this week in Memphis.
But you see so many artists, we talk about him reimagining other things. You see so many artists reimagining him also as well, because of the influence that's out there. And again, I think one of the things that I would just want to emphasize, I think he gets shortchanged by the icon status, is, it's easy to forget he was a talented singer, talented musician. I mean, it's easy to get lost in the icon and forget the talent, if that makes any sense. because we certainly live in a culture where it's easy for folks who don't have an incredible amount of talent to still be successful, taking what little they have. And Elvis is far beyond that. Again, you raised an issue I hadn't even thought about, was what happens with a post 77, movie career or a TV career or whatever, or some combination of those things. By the 80s and the 90s, especially, as HBO and other premium channels begin to start producing stuff, it became respectable for movie actors to do TV, eventually at some point, so you can easily imagine that was a place that Elvis could have gone as well. So, wow. I have to think more about that. We may have to come back and revisit this at some point, Dylan, thinking about, what happens down the road. Anything that we missed here that you wanted to make sure we get put into the episode?
I think that's pretty much it. All I'll say is that I've those of you who haven't seen the new Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie, it does a really good job of kind of showing what we've been talking about, sort of deconstructing the myth of Elvis and actually showing the man behind it and sort of the actual person. The movie, just like any other depiction of Elvis, it has its flaws, but, Don, I know you said you hadn't seen it. I think you're going to really enjoy it, especially if you're going to watch it, make sure you have a good sound system, because the soundtrack to this movie is incredible. But I think, it really does do a good job of illustrating the fact that Elvis was a man just like the rest of us. He likes butter and grease and fat, and he has fried peanut butter and jelly sandwich just like the rest of us. So I think if people take nothing else from this, other than going back and listening to the old Elvis tunes, just remember that he just like all the rest of us was just a guy trying to make his way in the world and do the best for his family. And, that's all anybody can hope to do.
I think that's a good way to sort of close things down. And also saying, one of the things that I was reminded last night was he came from what would be very easily described as abject poverty.
Yes.
And it's easy to look at what might be considered his foibles or his failings without putting the whole context and perspective of where he had been in his life to where he was in his life, and the fact that all of us, struggle with whatever we struggle with, and that's particularly true given our past and then where we find ourselves at. And treating him not as an icon, but treating him and thinking about him as a person is an important part, I think, that we forget to do with any person that's famous. We think about them as a two-dimensional facade when they're actually a three-dimensional person. And I think, Elvis deserves that better treatment. We all deserve that better treatment. There's a lot of folks that we think about and talk about today that deserve a better treatment than just to be considered, either only by their best moments or their worst moments. They have their life as a series of moments like all of ours are. So I think that's a good way to think about the king. And by the way, if I say the king, probably 50% of the population, everybody knows, which says a lot about what it needs to say. Dylan, I appreciate you coming forward and suggesting the topic. Also appreciate you joining here today. Going to use this to transition into sort of the closeout from the show. If you've enjoyed this episode, you have a topic, you could be the next Dylan. One of the things that we like doing here on A Fork in Time, it's how we've grown to the team that's part of the podcast now, as we like to say, as Alexis and I have said so often, build a community around the idea of alternate history here. And that's not always about going to England and something Henry VIII. We do that a lot for the reasons that we joke about that on the show. But I actually enjoy what I call these sort of these lighter topics, sort of these pop culture things, and they're fun places to go as well. But Dylan, other than the fact that you had to wait a while for me to get back to you because of all the stuff that's been going on, this was pretty easy, right? To get to this point, all things considered.
Oh yeah. I loved it.
So we welcome any of you out there that are listeners. Go to the website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. You'll see a place there to suggest a topic, and almost every topic that gets suggested that we choose to pursue, and we have a whole backlog of those right now. We have a back catalog of about 30 topics. We don't lack for what we want to do next, just getting around to doing them. But I'll normally reach out to the person that suggests the topic, particularly if it's a good one, and say, hey, you want to join us? And we like doing that. So if you've enjoyed Dylan today, like I have, bring your topic on, and we'd love to have you too. It's part of what we do here. This is this is a small niche podcast. We don't have sponsors to answer to and producers to answer to. We get to do this ourselves. So just encourage you to do that. Obviously, visit the website, other ways that you can support the show and interact with the show, give us feedback as well. As I mentioned to Dylan off podcast, and we've released a couple of things here recently, gone through a lot with a lot of the members of the podcast team last couple of months. We are getting back into gear. It's a slow thing, but you'll see a more regular cadence with our episode release. And so if you get us a topic out there, we'll probably jump on it pretty quick because we're looking to move forward with those things. So Dylan, again, thanks for joining. And we're going to close out as we do most episodes here by reminding our listeners, we think it's a good idea if you happen across a fork in time that you ought to take it. Talk to you guys soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.